areas focusing on the therapeutics, medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics, as we see how IP has posed a concrete challenge for the world population to have access, if there are any effective and safe medicines and vaccines developed in the future. Issue universal access would be an issue if the IP and technology issue barrier will not be addressed. So for the therapeutics, as we know, there's a large group of medicines that are under clinical trial for treatment. And we probably remember seeing a lot of news since the beginning of the pandemic. Many different medicines have been tested and trialed. And then, but the efficacy and safety are still need to be approved, and we still need more data to tell us which one and which some of them, maybe some of them, or one of them, or a group of different drugs to be used together might be effective for patients at different stage of the infection. So the issues of concern is that the large group of therapeutics under clinical trial, many of them are repurposed medicines, meaning that they existed before the pandemic and then they were developed and used for other diseases. So in the pandemic, because of the clinical experiences, the scientists, data and so on, some of them were brought into the picture to say that could also be tested for COVID treatment. Notably, one of the medicine we all familiar with, remdesivir from Gilead, is such an example, because the medicine was developed originally testing even for hepatitis C and other antivirals, but then focused the development of remdesivir was aiming to treat Ebola virus infection. But then the Ebola clinical trial wasn't so successful for Gilead. And then since the beginning of the pandemic of COVID-19, this drug was coming back to the picture of public debate. And then notably also, if we follow the news of remdesivir closely, it was a medicine that was developed with huge public funding, especially from US government, and also with the ruling out of clinical trial. We know many countries are joining the clinical trial under the WHO Solidarity Trial, and also their trial managed by company Gilead itself. So if we have some limited data to show some efficacy of the remdesivir, but then the more data needed. But if remdesivir was successful, showing huge efficacy, the success is not about Gilead alone. It's about many people contributed to that. However, we also know Gilead holds a patent on remdesivir, and it's already been granted in many countries, and it's being applied for in more than 70 developing countries. And then it was a repurposed medicine. So, and Gilead also entered into voluntary license agreement with a few generic companies, and according to their press release, half of the world population were excluded, and many high burden countries such as Brazil and most of the South American countries were excluded. So as a repurposed drug, and to what extent the remdesivir's patent status and its licensing practice would stand in the way to the global access, to what extent this set up a very negative precedent for other companies who may have more effective candidate than remdesivir. Maybe they will adopt the same business strategy. That would be a huge question and concern for us. So apart from repurposed medicine, there were possibility to have patent on different formulations. If we talk about patients groups, it could include formulation for adults and formulation to the pediatric for children, and a different way of using the medicines, those secondary patent application could potentially emerge in the coming months out of the COVID clinical trial and the drug development process. And in addition to remdesivir and other chemical medicines, there's also a huge pipeline on biological medicines. Monoclonal antibody candidates have been found with very high level of patenting application globally. So to what those examples shows the IP barrier is real for us in terms of combating COVID-19. And for vaccines, so we probably often hear pharma industry and some institution like Gavi and CEPI, they say, okay, IP is not the issue. Now we need to get everybody start producing vaccines through technology transfer and so. But is this true? Really, IP is not an issue? From our experiences, this is not really true. So there's a broader range of IP issues that vaccine development and manufacture would face. So when we talk about a COVID-19 vaccine, we're talking about a group of technology platforms that are being used by different industry. And those majority, and let's see, all of the platform existed before, and the research has found a huge number of patents and other IP attached to those platforms. There was a recent paper published on Nature find out for mRNA platform that is used by Moderna. So now there's big news today about this company. Moderna, one of the company developing the candidates. For this kind of platform, there's at least more than 100 patents attached to the mRNA technology platform. So when people talk about IP issues related to the vaccine, we need to talk about the background technology that's being used by the company today, that those technology were developed before by other people, and then there were patents attached to that. Now there might be future vaccine technology future vaccine candidate product could be subject to patent, and there might be new technologies and process being developed during this process of COVID development. They could also be subject for patent application by the industry. In addition to patents, we're also facing know-how, clinical data, some of the trade secrets, some of the technical tricks that if other company other than the developer want to develop and produce COVID vaccine, they will need to get access to those information and technologies. And oftentimes we know, we see the news, companies sign a lot of licensing and collaboration with different companies. All of those agreements so far in COVID situation are confidential. So as public, we don't actually know what's being signed and then to what extent it will guarantee global access. So in the past experience with MSF, we also see how the company exercising patent filing for pneumococcal conjugate vaccines and other new vaccines that are super expensive for developing countries. And there's a very broad patenting scope that have been identified in our report. So I will quickly show a graph.
Yeah.
Graphic.
You have 5 more minutes. So
okay. Yeah. So this graphic quickly show at which stage of vaccine development patent have been applied for and granted on vaccines. So we see from the starting point, from the biological materials, gene sequence, process, product, and finally, how do you immunize people? All of these the steps industry have been seeking monopoly. So when it's come to COVID-19, which is a global pandemic, we think this kind of practice should not be allowed. So government should take action. In terms of diagnostics, I will quickly go through here without detail. In our past experience, it's very different scenario. the patent portfolio in diagnosis are huge. And the situation is that each company develop their own system, so you cannot switch in between different testing, which makes the whole system very inefficient. So more analysis are needed in this field. But we already see in order to develop some of the testing kits, the chemical materials of the reagent could be under monopoly and then blocking countries from producing and scaling up the tests. There are some examples from Netherlands. They have been rejected from Roche to supply reagent material for their local company to ramping up their production. So there are some options, as we know, TRIPS flexibilities, and some companies say we will sign voluntary license, so you will be fine. You know, everybody will get access to IP and technology. But the reality is that we know oftentimes those options are very limited. With voluntary license, there could be restricted terms, and oftentimes we don't know what has been signed for. And then the traditional approach of tackling IP on the case-by-case and product-by-product basis would be very limited in the pandemic. And we also know industry has rejected many proposals, such as the WHO's proposal to have a global pool of IP, and industry openly rejected that. So far in the pandemic, we haven't seen lots transformative practice in terms of overcoming this the barrier until last Friday. And we saw South Africa and India submitted a proposal to WTO asking for a waiver to all WTO members so that they don't have to implement and enforce IP during the pandemic. So the waiver they propose should be valid until the world population, majority of the population, have access to effective vaccine and develop the immunity. So it's a very brief step in our view, and the waiver is totally legal according to WTO rule. It's been used before, and it will be benefiting for all of the members in the world, and everybody. All of the government would, if this waiver was successful, would have the full freedom to collaborate to each other and in research, and it will not be restricted by the industry's monopoly. And so that for us would bring a real game change. So I will skip those details of how decision was made. As we know, the TRIPS Council will be meeting on the 15th of October next week. So the importance, as we said, this is really one of the silver lining event that happened out of the very frustrating situation as we face in the COVID-19. So we'll stop here, and hopefully this development will call for a strong state responsibility so that the global access to all people can be ensured. Thank you. So I will end my presentation here.
Thank you, Yuan, for keeping the time. And actually, you finished 14 minutes. So
Thank you.
1 minute. 1 minute. So before we move to the next speaker, there is a small housekeeping announcement. We strongly urge all participants to place the questions in the question answer chat box, not the normal chat box. So that is open for question answer now. Now we are moving to the next speaker. As I already mentioned to you, it's Professor David Levin. So he will take you through the implications of trade secret. Trade secret always gives us the impression of only Coca-Cola, but he will tell us it goes beyond Coca-Cola and it impacts our day-to-day life. David.
Thank you, Gopa, and thank you for the invitation from the Third World Network as well for this opportunity. This morning here on the East Coast of the United States, it is a blessing that we have this technology that allows us to do these kinds of webinars throughout the globe, particularly given all the difficulties that the world is facing based upon COVID-19. So I'm going to take my time here, as Yuan mentioned, to kind of go over a little bit from a top level the trade secret issues that arise in the context of battling COVID-19. And it's a very, very important issue. Excuse me. Apologies. It's also very misunderstood and not focused on all that much in spaces that otherwise it should. So I'm going to attempt to give you kind of a nice summary of these issues, and then I'm happy to take on more detailed questions later on in Q&A. So generally speaking, when we're thinking about trade secrecy, we're thinking about information that's valuable because it's not known by a competitor. And trade secret law operates within the IP panoply of trademarks, patents, and copyrights in kind of an unusual space, because it focuses primarily on access to information rather than generally what patents focus on, which is use. So it's very important to recognize up front, before I talk about these issues in more detail on this talk, that trade secrets are about even getting access to information, much less understanding it or using it. Which is why the standard advice that one gives in the trade secret realm is, if you want to keep a trade secret, you shouldn't disclose it. Which of course sounds great in theory, but in practice doesn't work very well if you want to monetize that information. So generally speaking, in the United States, but also in the EU and other places where trade secret law is either codified or where it's been created through the judicial system, the prima facie trade secret cause of action is first having a trade secret. And trade secrets being defined as valuable from not being generally known and subject to reasonable efforts to keep secrets. And this is where cybersecurity, but also just basic good hygiene in terms of how you store information and who you share it with becomes important. But beyond that, where we see trade secret law arise, it's in the context of acquisition by improper means, defined as things like theft and bribery in the United States under what's known as the Uniform Trade Secrets Act, or the UTSA. Lastly, there needs to be some kind of misappropriation, which we understand as use or disclosure. Trade secret law rise, not just in the United States, but really throughout the world. In the United States, a few years ago, Congress passed, and President Obama, in one of his last acts as president, signed the Defend Trade Secrets Act, which creates a federal private cause of action for trade secret misappropriation. There have also been amendments to the U.S. Patent Act, which drives individuals who have information that could be patented actually away from patenting and towards trade secrecy for reasons that I could get into but aren't terribly relevant here. But more importantly is the explosion of trade secrets litigation, again, not just in the United States and the EU, but really throughout the world. Many folks know about Waymo v. Uber, but also there's a growing number of cases under the DTSA in the United States, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes, there's a worldwide concern about information theft. And folks on this webinar know quite well that what we're talking about here in part is nationalism, right? And in the context of COVID-19, of course, that's the who gets the vaccines, who gets the treatments first. And nationalism, unfortunately, plays a role there, and trade secrecy is at the center of it. Lastly, we have the EU Trade Secrets Directive, which is the EU's effort to codify trade secret law. And that's a more recent development, although it has some benefits with regard to access that I can talk about later. So when we're thinking about COVID-19 trade secret issues, really all of the key concerns that civil society groups have with regard to how COVID-19 vaccines and treatments and diagnostics are created come up, right? Issues of access to those medicines, in addition to affordability, right? And affordability literally meaning are we going to allow intellectual property law to render these vaccines outside of the economic means of much of the world's population? And of course, that's the focus of the wonderful groups that are on this call. And I should emphasize, as I said prior to the beginning of our session, you know, I'm an academic. I'm a full-time law professor. I do a lot of this work as part of what I consider to be my responsibility as one privileged to be in academia and do this work. But the folks, the other people that are speaking on this call are on the front lines, and I admire their work and I respect what they're doing, and I really view myself as trying to help however I can, because the issue of affordability is obviously huge. But also, when we're talking about trade secrets in this context, it's also about effectiveness, right? It's the ability to create not only these vaccines that are accessible and affordable, but that in fact work. And not being a medical scientist, I'll simply say, but don't kill us. And scale, right? The creation of these treatments on a scale necessary to literally, of course, unprecedented, perhaps in human history, but certainly in the last 100 years, to attempt to more or less vaccinate the entire world. So all of these issues come up, and trade secrecy is at the center of it. For the public at large, trade secrets in this context raise two primary issues. The first is, when do you have a COVID trade secret? But then secondly, and perhaps more difficult question is, should access to that trade secret extend not just to civil society groups like those on this call, and perhaps even the public, but really here we're thinking about, should competitors be compelled or should they be encouraged to share trade secrets so as to more effectively battle the virus? There's lots of trade secrets that come up in this context, folks. It's really quite remarkable. And when I go down this list, you'll see how so many of these issues arise. Manufacturing processes are standard textbook trade secrets, as well as manufacturing methods, for reasons, again, I can talk about in Q&A. But also test and effectiveness data are trade secrets. And the ability to access comparator data and the other data necessary to determine whether, in fact, a given medical treatment is even working are trade secrets. Formulas, including medical formulas, are also textbook examples of trade secrets. Cell lines and assays, more specifically in this context, trade secrets. Genomic information, trade secrets, and perhaps, and this surprises some folks, negative information. What doesn't work is a trade secret. And we can think about that for a moment and just consider the possibility that one of the pharmaceutical companies right now may have discovered that a process which is commonly used in the industry, in fact, doesn't work in this context because of new methods that are, and new concerns with regard to this virus. The fact that that competitor knows that a process doesn't work is a trade secret. But consider the possibilities if that kind of negative information were shared within the industry, preventing what we say in English as the reinvention of the wheel, or spinning wheels, or just duplicating research, right? So literally that idea of speed plays a big role in trade secrecy as well, because of course it's to the competitive advantage of a pharmaceutical agent, an entity, to keep this information as a trade secret. Combinations of generally known information, trade secrets, technology platforms, trade secrets, and financial information, also trade secrets. And I should emphasize here that when you're thinking about this issue in the context of COVID, recognize that the argument is not that all trade secrets should go away or we need to share all information. As I'm going to talk about in a second, some of this information probably doesn't need to be shared, but the information that should be shared is what we have to focus on. So if you think about the second question, which I'm getting to now, which is, should this happen? There's some very, very positive language in TRIPS and Doha that give us reason to think that certainly from a legislative standpoint, there is some precedent for making these kinds of arguments. Articles 7 and 8 of TRIPS, of the Trade-Related Aspects of IP Rights Agreement, indicates that the need to transfer technology and to balance the interests of producers and users is a good idea, and that may sound kind of, bland, but it's actually very important in this context for reasons I'm going to talk about in a second. But also Article 8, right, allows expressly members to adopt measures necessary to promote public health, including possibly trade secrecy. But perhaps most promisingly, in the Doha Declaration, we see some really incredible language, right, where in Doha, the signatory parties said that we affirm that the agreement can and should be interpreted and implemented in a manner supportive of WTO's members' rights to protect public health, and in particular, and this is of course my emphasis, to promote access to medicines for all. In this connection, we reaffirm the right of WTO members to use to the full the provisions in the TRIPS agreement, which provide flexibility for this purpose. And again, considering that we're dealing with a global pandemic, considering that we're dealing with significant power disparities, which of course the organizations on this call admirably try to push up against, the fact that Doha has this language, I think, quite frankly, can help these arguments to have more currency in places where they may not. So how do we think this through as I close this part of my discussion? And again, I'm happy to pick this up in Q&A. And certainly, again, Yuan gave us a wonderful overview and a terrific summary of very complex challenges on the patent side. On the trade secret side, we can see similar challenges. Again, as I've said repeatedly, trade secrecy is an information access control mechanism. And we see that fact played out most recently here, but everything from code inside voting machines to the chemical processes used in hydraulic fracturing, or what's known as fracking, right, are trade secrets. And for those that aren't familiar with my work, more or less for the last 15 years, I've been working in this space, trying to get us to understand more broadly that trade secrecy operates in this way, and that it doesn't have to be that way in order for there to be innovation. Trade secrecy operates, as I mentioned, in the context of national security. And unfortunately for these kinds of arguments, the reality is that we are going to face and have faced and will continue to face the notion that if you mess with trade secret law or you weaken trade secret law, what you're really doing is weakening the national security interests of any country that holds trade secrets. And let me be absolutely clear, right? There's some good reason to say that that's right. Right? There's no question that there are bad actors on the world stage that attempt to go after defense industry technologies, right, and use them adversarially against other countries. That is a reality of the world, but at the same time, those aren't all trade secrets. And so, for example, should we treat, right, negative information about failed vaccine development processes the same way as we treat artificial intelligence technologies used in weapon systems, right? In my opinion, absolutely not. And moreover, there's no reason to. Which gets to my third point, which is that trade secrecy and trade secrets are granular. It is not and should not be treated as one size fits all. The way that the furniture industry uses trade secrets is very different than the way the chemical industry uses it, which is very different than the pharmaceutical industry. You can look at a piece of furniture and figure out what it is. And for reasons that I can get into, that more or less means if you can copy it and create it, you probably don't have a lot of trade secrets. That's not true, of course, of vaccines as easily. It's not true of chemical formulas, and that's important to consider as well. Of course, on this call, it's very important to note that it's not just about competitors. Trade secret stakeholders have to include and have to be understood to include not only the organizations on this call, but also the public at large. And so that's an important point which is not well understood as either. Trade secrecy, therefore, is not sacrosanct. And we saw this morning, and I can't comment on it too much because I haven't read it closely, but Moderna came out with a statement just a few hours ago that indicates that they are perhaps going to be less forceful in their enforcement of patents maybe that means that there's some voluntary licensing that can occur, not only in that context, but through the WHO's COVID-19 technology access pool. More challenging, of course, would be a compulsory trade secret licensing regime, which generally speaking doesn't exist. Of course, the next pandemic, and of course, there will be one, right, based upon experts' indications, means that we need to think about these issues now. The bottom line is, this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, folks. In other words, the argument doesn't have to be, nor should it be, that the pharmaceutical industry must give up profits. I actually don't think that's necessary. I think, in fact, the argument can be, again, from the self-serving perspective of a profit-making entity, and I don't hold that against them, is to say, look, you can actually not only do as well, but do better by sharing some information amongst competitors that would create more consumer confidence that the vaccine that's ultimately available is going to be effective, right? And you could actually do more sales and do better as an industry, not only for consumer confidence, but for, again, developing holistically the kinds of treatments that we need to challenge COVID if you reconsider how trade secrecy is used. So I'll stop here. I look forward to comments and questions during the Q&A, and I'll hand it back over to the next speaker.
Thank you, David. You were dot on time. Now let me invite Achal start his presentation. As I already mentioned, Achal will focus on the regulatory as well as intellectual property barriers on COVID vaccines. Achal.
Thanks, Gopa. I just want to quickly go through this again.
You are not audible. There is some sound disturbance still. Achal, I think you are muted.
No, I have unmuted myself, Gopa. I'm so sorry. Can you hear me any better now?
Okay, I'm just going to try this again.
Yeah, it's working fine now.
Yeah, this is perfect. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Sorry about this. Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me here. My name is Achal Prabhala. I am the coordinator of the AccessIBASA project. We work on access to medicines in India, Brazil, and South Africa. I'm going to present work here that is a collective exercise. It's been going on since January of 2019, and I know that sounds like a very long time. We started working on looking at intellectual property and regulation barriers to biologics in general, of which vaccines are one part. Long before the coronavirus pandemic, we were primarily motivated by things such as the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine that prevents infant mortality from pneumonia, and a number of other biologics, which were drugs increasingly used to treat cancer, such as trastuzumab, which were, as a result of their monopoly pricing, inaccessible to people in countries like South Africa and India. It's taken us this long for a couple of reasons that I'll explain, which are part of the problem and part of our recommendations as to what we can do with biologics. But I'll quickly just go through crediting a bunch of people and organizations that have helped us. We started this with the help of the Shuttleworth Foundation, of which I'm a fellow, and we're continuing the work with the support of the Open Society Foundations. And the work has been conducted over the last year and a half by a team comprising of myself, Firoz Ali, Ramya Seshadri, Roshan John, and two other people who, as a result of the amount of time we spent working on this project, have subsequently joined law firms whose employment, therefore, is threatened if we name them. We're very grateful to them. They're people with a background in molecular biology and chemistry, without which we wouldn't have been able to make as much headway as we did because of the complex scientific nature of what we have to deal with here. I'm going to do this slightly differently. I'm going to start with a small story explaining how regulation and intellectual property barriers tangibly manifest by going 10 years back. And then I'll have a few slides, but I'll speak in between the slides. I don't have as detailed slides as the previous participants. And I'm going to try to narratively describe what we've been doing. About 10 years ago, the world turned its attention to primarily infant mortality from pneumonia. Pneumonia is a problem that affects people of all ages, but infant mortality was a particularly acute problem, and Gavi, in fact, took up this issue as one of his very early campaigns and began an AMC that was designed specifically for the PCV. I don't want to say the PCV vaccine because it's sort of grammatically incorrect. The pneumococcal conjugate vaccines, vaccines against pneumonia had been around since the 1980s, but it tended to be one of those things which were really only used in rich countries. Gavi began an AMC to inoculate infants across the developing world against pneumonia. And over the course of about 10 years, paid two companies, GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer, who held patents and other monopolies on two roughly equivalent but different vaccines, about $21 per vaccine. They charged countries like India a slightly lower amount. They charged us $10 for 3 courses of this vaccine. So it was a subsidized price. And the other $10 was paid for by charitable donations Gavi received from institutions like the Gates Foundation, as well as overseas development assistance from countries like the United Kingdom and other rich countries. Now, at the same time, in 2010, there were 2 Indian efforts to produce equivalent vaccines. One was at the Serum Institute in Pune. The other was at Panacea Biotech, which is a large geographically distributed company in India that makes biologics and vaccines. Both of them went awry. The Serum Institute vaccine had to be re-engineered in order not to infringe upon GlaxoSmithKline's patents. It took many years to develop, and then it took several years to put through the Indian regulatory system. So many years, in fact, that it only came to the market in 2019, literally a few months before Gavi wound down the PCV AMC. Gavi claims that it is very excited about the fact that it was able to lower the price of pneumonia vaccines by a considerable amount. They omit to mention that that lowering in price only happened at the very tail end of their AMC, which they weren't fully able to utilize. The reason that Serum Institute took 9 years to 10 years to produce this vaccine was because of the regulatory barriers they faced in India, which meant that for this vaccine, they had to run the gamut of trials from development to preclinical trials right up to phase 3 and phase 4. The second effort was Panacea. Panacea started around the same time, and they were trying to replicate the Pfizer vaccine. And the first thing they did was to file pre-grant patent oppositions against the Pfizer vaccine. They lost. The Indian Patent Office upheld Pfizer's patents, and as a result, they had to abandon their plans to make this vaccine. Now, in the early years of this decade, the last decade, if the Serum Institute and Panacea had been successful, if they could have surmounted intellectual property barriers, if they didn't exist, if the regulatory system was more rational, we would have had a vaccine that was available at $2 a dose from either of these two companies, which would have meant that the price of 3 doses of this vaccine would have been exactly 1/3 what Gavi spent to buy these vaccines, which in turn would have meant that Gavi could have inoculated 3 times as many people in the period of the PCV AMC had these biosimilars or generic vaccines existed. And that's really what the cost of intellectual property and regulation barriers to vaccines is. So now I'm going to get into our work. Just hold on a second. I'm trying to set up this slide. Yeah. All right, great. What I'm going to be talking about in terms of biologics and patent barriers to begin with is the application of 3 principles that are encoded in Indian patent law. One is 3C. There's a long explanation. The short explanation of 3C is that substances occurring in nature are not normally patentable. The other is 3D. 3D is the infamous Indian provision that prevents ordinarily the patenting of a new form of a known substance or a new use of a known substance or the mere use of a known process. Notice that all the examples that are listed under 3D here, isomers, mixtures of isomers, complexes, combinations, salts, esters, ethers, polymers, all refer to small molecules, not large molecules or biologics. And the third section is 3E, which is what relates to mere admixtures, and which really means combinations of drugs, that you cannot merely combine drugs to obtain a new product unless you can show a significant amount of synergy. What we're working with here, what we've been doing over the last year and a half, is looking at 275 rejected patent applications for biologics.
Could you change the slides?
I'm sorry?
Could you change the slides? I think you're still on slide number 1 and...
Oh, I did change the slide. I don't know how. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know. Huh. I'm still on slide number 1.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a Linux problem. Okay. So here's slide number 1.
3C, yeah.
This is slide number 1. Now you've got slide number 2. What about now? Slide number 3. Can you see it?
No.
No? Okay. I'm really sorry. I honestly...
You can manually click with the... Now we can.
Now you can see. Yeah. 3D.
Okay, fine. So I'll just do this instead of the... Yeah. Okay. So, so as I was just saying, what the work that we've done on patent barriers relates to 3 sections of Indian patent law: 3C, which is the unpatentability of natural substances; 3D, new forms of known substances, new uses of known substances; and 3E, which relate to combinations of drugs, combinations of molecules which ordinarily would not be patentable. What we're working with is 275 rejected patent applications that relate to biologics and 1,860 granted patent applications. I'm now going to, how do I disable screen share here? Is there a way to do that?
You want to disable, or now it's working? You can
Sorry?
go to the next. Yeah, you let
stop sharing.
Stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So what I'd like to talk about here is 2 things. So one is that biologics are not identified as biologics. They don't come with a label saying I'm a biologic. What that means is that it's left to us to try to figure out what these drugs are. That is a very, very difficult task. We started with 12,000 granted applications, and we had to whittle those down to about 1,800. That process itself cost us a lot of money, and we spent something like 6 months merely working on identifying patent applications that were granted that related to biologic drugs. This is a much bigger problem than it sounds like. Both at an international level and at an Indian level, there are vague categories that encompass biologics drugs on occasion, but no specific category for biologics, which means that the first thing that's really hard to do is to identify what patent applications relate to a biologic. That takes incredible time and effort, and is one of the reasons why there's been so little work done on it. But the second problem, which is a really impossible problem to solve easily, is the fact that the principles in our patent law, indeed in any patent law anywhere in the world that was written more than about 10 to 15 years ago, ours was amended in 2005, really only covers small molecules. Its anti-evergreening provisions are written for small molecules. They're not written for biologics. Our patent law doesn't understand them. We have guidelines for biotechnology, again, hopelessly inadequate to cover them. What does that mean? What it means is that, for instance, we have done a deep dive into an analysis of 3 categories, subcategories of biologics: antibodies, proteins and peptides, and vaccines. And what we found in vaccines, for instance, is, take one ground on which a vaccine application was rejected. So one of those grounds is a point mutant of a known protein. So then what we did was we looked at other vaccine applications that have been granted, and we said, okay, so, a mutant of a known protein, would that be rejected as well? And in fact, it's been granted on several occasions. In one case, for a canine vaccine, it was rejected on the basis of being inadmissible under Section 3D. In many other cases, there was an objection raised overcome and granted. There is no consistency. When we get to proteins and peptides, for instance, composition claims are notoriously easy to overcome at the patent office, despite in some cases having been rejected for being mere compositions which do not demonstrate the required synergy, an unexpected synergy. Many other composition claims with exactly as meager data have been granted. When it comes to antibodies, especially, Section 3C, which is not used as much, which is the unpatentability ordinarily of substances occurring naturally in nature, we find several objections raised along these lines, all of which, in some cases, which are rejected, and in other cases, which are granted on the basis that there's been substantial human intervention in synthesizing or recreating these antibodies. So what's the problem here really is inconsistency. What that inconsistency stems from is an inability to understand how the principles encoded in Indian patent law would extend to complex large molecules like biologics. So biologics are basically just drugs which are just much, much more complex. Ordinary drugs, small molecules, are a molecule. Biologics are molecule upon molecule upon molecule. They contain some element of a living organism. That in turn means that there is a variability, and so the regulation process is difficult. I'm going to switch back to sharing my screen for a second. And so what we need to do around addressing these patent barriers is firstly to figure out a system for identifying biologics at an international and at a national level. We need to extend patent law principles in India and elsewhere, depending on the kind of principles encoded in law, because obviously ours is different, through guidelines, either through an amendment or better, or in the interim, through guidelines that clearly explain how biologics should be examined, because at the moment it's a free-for-all. We need to ensure legibility. We have to know what biologics are and know what to look for, not just within biologics, but subcategories of biologics, which have different characteristics. Your criteria for evaluation of antibodies necessarily has to be different from the criteria for evaluation of vaccines. And finally, we have to ensure consistency, which is not something that the Indian Patent Office has been historically very good at doing. So the next thing I'm going to move to quickly, mindful of time, is regulation.
2 more minutes.
Sorry?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay. I'm going to quickly go into regulation barriers in biologics. Here we are. All right. There are 2 ways in which regulation barriers are affecting us. There is excessive regulation and there's unfair anti-competitive regulation. What they do combined is to create a near-permanent intractable monopoly. There are other problems that affect the biosimilar market. These are interchangeability and data exclusivity. We don't have those in India, but interchangeability, for instance, in the United States is the inability of a customer to substitute an equivalent biologic, especially if it's cheaper, because there is a separate standard for interchangeability in the US. That isn't the case here. It isn't the case in some, but not all European countries. We don't have data exclusivity, so we don't have other market exclusivities that affect the emergence of biologics. Many rich countries in the world do, and that's a significant problem. So the reason that the Serum Institute took 9 years to produce an equivalent vaccine was not just because they had to spend 2 years re-engineering it to get around IP, because theirs was a vaccine that was being produced by them, that had been formulated by them. The Indian drug regulator, the CDSCO, treats it as a new vaccine, even though there is an equivalent vaccine. It doesn't do an equivalence test. It asks the Serum Institute to run the gamut of clinical trials from start to finish. Now, Serum Institute is also at the moment producing the AstraZeneca Oxford University vaccine. That vaccine, however, is registered at the regulator in India as a change in facility. And so as long as AstraZeneca's vaccine is successful and passes clinical trials in the United Kingdom or in Europe, the Serum Institute will only have to run phase 3 and phase 4 clinical trials, which they've already started doing here in India, because they are an authorized licensee of AstraZeneca and are merely producing the same vaccine at what is called a change-in facility. The moment you re-engineer some of the technology to get around IP, you use one adjuvant instead of another. The moment you, maybe even without IP, actually just use exactly what's there to create exactly the same vaccine, because you're not starting with the cell lines and the biological material that the originator used, because you are not working with exactly the same technology process as the originator used, your vaccine is treated as a new product, which will therefore be evaluated like any new product with the full gamut of clinical trials. There are technically some exceptions to this, ways of determining what they call pharmacokinetic equivalence and pharmacodynamic equivalence really early on, which if you can prove, which is to say, if you can prove your products are not too variant from the reference product, which is the originator product, you're sometimes in India and in some other legislations allowed to be given a waiver for the subsequent clinical trials. In reality, that's never actually happened because the variant standards are really tight. It means that even the originator product often would fail if it was evaluated by those standards. And it means that any non-authorized vaccine or biosimilar that is being produced at another location by another company will be treated as an entirely new product. This is very chilling, obviously, in the coronavirus pandemic. And one of the problems is that the WHO has to do a lot more to provide guidelines that the entire world can understand and follow and be comfortable with in terms of the efficacy, safety, and deployment of vaccines and other biologics, in order not to replicate and create a kind of regulatory excess. Gavi, in the short run, definitely has to negotiate full tech transfer, including biological material, without which it's very difficult to imagine how, with the kind of regulation we're strangled with, we could produce any kind of coronavirus vaccines in the short run. In the long run, the entire regulatory mechanism for biologics has to be overhauled and rationalized. Gavi has the ability to help the WHO to do something like that, to the extent that Gavi's mission is to deliver vaccines to the entire world. That's simply not possible at the moment with the kind of regulatory mechanisms that we are stuck with, which add a distinct layer on top of the already strangulatory intellectual property barriers that exist. So that's me. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Achal. So I'll open up the floor for question and answers. Before that, I would like to invite Thiru Balasubramaniam of KEI to make a short intervention on the Moderna statement and Moderna's announcement that it will not enforce patents. What does it mean in the context, in our context? So Thiru.
Thanks, Gopa Kumar. Yes, I think I was also surprised, as everyone else today, to see the announcement from Moderna. And I also have to, carefully review the language along with my colleagues. But just to provide context, as I might have done in the Q&A box, currently, well, as of last month in September, there are 2 U.S. agencies, both DARPA, which is associated with the military, the U.S. Pentagon, and then BARDA, are investigating Moderna because of failure to disclose government funding in their patent applications in the United States, and that was actually the basis for those investigations were researched by my colleagues at KEI. And just one other point, I really appreciated the presentation by Professor Levine on trade secrets, and I would just add that in advance of the TRIPS Council meeting, actually in the summer, South Africa raised several concerns, and I put them up in the Q&A box. Concerns in relation to trade secrets. Yes, so that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Turu. I'll be opening up the floor for discussion. So mainly we will be reading out the question answers. People have put up questions on the question answer chat box. But prior to that, let me just ask one question each to each panelist so they can explain to us much more clearly the regulatory and IP barriers which we will be facing, especially in the context of vaccines. So let me start with David Levin. So you mentioned there is a public policy implications of trade secret. So whether this trade secret can be used to suppress safety and efficacy data related to vaccine in the coming days. So what's your call on that? What's your view on that? Or any kind of adverse health impacts?
Oh, sorry. Well, I apologize. But what was the last part?
I'm saying that any kind of adverse impact on human health. In the past, the tobacco industry never used trade secrets to suppress many studies which flagged the adverse impact of smoking on human health. So similarly, whether the trade secret can be used to deny access to the full data set of various clinical trials carried out by the pharmaceutical industry or the vaccine industry.
Right. I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, not only can it, but it is. There are certain. The European Medicines Agency, for example, has certain requirements with regard to disclosure of some clinical data. But as a general matter, trade secrecy operates in this space to prevent access to literally any information that is valuable because it's not known by a competitor. And so, for example, when we're dealing with, generally speaking, data, and more specifically, data that proves or proves either the efficacy or the effectiveness of a given process or the opposite, that is classic trade secret information. And by way of parallel to contextualize this issue, right, while again the COVID battle may be new in a lot of ways, these kinds of access to information battles in the context of trade secrecy are not. When I mentioned hydraulic fracturing briefly, I've done a lot of work over the last 10 years dealing with questions of how we prove whether and how we know whether fracking has environmental health and safety risks. And of course, one of the ways to do that is to have well data, have data that indicates what a given fracking well is doing and whether it leaks chemicals and whether it leaks gas and so forth. Long story short, those are all trade secrets, and it's been exceptionally difficult anywhere in the world, really, to get access to this information where trade secret law operates. The good news is, and I try to be as positive as possible about this. The good news is, from a trade secret law perspective, that again, trade secrets are necessary for all forms of development. But the challenge really for civil society groups and for folks on this call and others is, and I'll say this clearly, is that your expertise is absolutely essential to make those arguments. I am a trade secret scholar. I am not an expert in vaccine development. In order to challenge these kinds of arguments made by the pharmaceutical industry, it requires experts to say, wait a minute, this piece of information that you're claiming as a trade secret isn't really one that you need in order to turn a profit. And that's the hard part of having this discussion in the context of IP, as everyone on this call knows quite well. Intellectual property law is built fundamentally, either completely or partially throughout the globe, on the premise that we give property rights so that IP owners can make money. And so long as that's the case, then at some level arguments need to be made that challenge the premise that you're not going to make money if you share this information. That's simply not true. But it takes a lot of work to do that. More specifically, I will say, and again, this Moderna statement, as Tiru mentioned, is one that everyone really needs to study closely. But having seen this kind of development occur, particularly in fracking, where one of the three chemical companies more or less said, you know what, we'll share more trade secret information, and to put it mildly, the world didn't end and the company didn't fold. I would hope that civil society groups throughout the globe take this as seriously as possible and build upon it, right? Push Moderna and push other entities to say, okay, you know, put your money where your mouth is. What are you going to share now? What can you share now, and engage? Because I think that's how it can be done. Because fundamentally, I can tell you point blank, because the pharmaceutical industry is no different than any other industry. Not all of the information that they claim is secret, and some of the information indeed that you'd want right now can be shared without these companies losing money.
Thank you, David. We will come back to you again, on related aspects. So now,
sure.
Let me move to Yuan. Many times, various pharmaceutical and vaccine companies, or even the funders like Gates Foundation, told us that when it comes to vaccine, patent is not the issue. It is the know-how, and therefore, use of flexibilities will not be working in the context of vaccine manufacturing. So how do you react to that, especially in the light of the South Africa and India joint proposal, which includes the waiver of some of these trade secrets? So trade know-how is protected mainly through a trade secret. So whether this kind of proposal is useful to overcome these barriers posed by the trade secret protection on know-how.
Thanks, Gopa. So for the trade secret and know-how, I will go back to David. So I will stay with the vaccine.
But in the context of this waiver proposal, how is it going to help? Yeah, that's what.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, so for start with the vaccine, yes, we often hear this, especially in a COVID situation. IP is not you, and we from MSF side, we have repeated to say we disagree, So we have a concrete experience in the past, how new vaccine access could be hindered because one company, like our experience with Pfizer on the pneumococcal conjugate 30-valent vaccine, we are still in dispute with them in India. So now, because the patent concretely stop the development. And we know there's a company in South Korea, because of one, patent that actually has been rejected in other countries. The same patent was rejected in China, for instance. So the Chinese producer can produce some, PCV 30 vaccine, but the same patent was granted in South Korea, and a company has to stop their production process and development process. So the same kind of experience did not ring a bell to the world nowadays, which makes us feeling very worried because we're facing a global pandemic and then a huge global public funding in a vaccine. It is really not really acceptable to repeatedly hearing the lobby group say it's not an issue, not an issue. So what do they mean by not an issue? Because even we are facing the moving target now, as I will briefly said in the presentation, people at least face 3 groups of IP so far. For the vaccines, we face a background IP that developed by somebody else and repurposed and used for now. It means that when companies or government agency enter into licensing discussion, technology transfer discussion, they need to know what kind of deal they are getting. Do they have the full package? Whether it is possible to navigate one technology per time, one vaccine per time, making sure there's an exhaustive list of things that have been licensed on. it's a very difficult question to tackle in the pandemic, because we know, I mentioned there was a study showing at least 100 patents on the mRNA, Moderna's, the platform Moderna use, but it's only one platform, right? So we're looking at 5 platforms used by all of the developers. How many technologies attached to each platform that for licensing and technology transfer negotiation, developing country, especially developing country government, need to be aware, or it's probably a more sufficient or effective program, say, because it's pandemic, let's forget about that for a moment, right? Let's give a waiver, a suspend, so that the sharing and collaboration can be freely and quickly done. So when company and government run into this question, they don't need to be worried about getting sued or be hampered or be put pressure. So that is for us both the claim of IP is not issue for vaccine is wrong, and on another hand, the waiver proposal from South Africa and India provide a hope. I think that is I'm telling my colleagues probably the most exciting development have seen since pandemic. Because we are looking at the deadlock now, when everybody recognize we need to access to technology and IP, and everybody are saying the right thing, but there's no concrete actions. So the proposal gave the opportunity to let the government come back to the driving seat, because they are trying to use a legal mechanism, give the flexibility and maximize the policy spaces, so there could be more efficient collaboration among governments. So I think that I will stop here. This would also apply to the know-how and undisclosed data protection obligation and the Section 7, according to the proposal. And many of us working in access medicine fields knows there's a huge issue of data exclusivity, in addition to the trade secret issue like David mentioned. Data exclusivity is also a concrete barrier that people will face in the coming months. So this proposal, in our view, should be supported by everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuan. Achal, my next question is you showed us clearly that the delay occurred in India to develop and market these 2 low-cost vaccines by the two companies. But at the same time, it took so much delay. And the reason for delay, you are pointing fingers at that access to the information, because some of this information were kept as trade secret. Therefore, these companies have to reinvent the wheel. And at the same time, most disturbing is that the regulatory system, in a way, enforcing trade secret by putting up a regulatory system which which asks the companies, if you are not access to the originator's material, then you have to repeat everything from the start. Is that so? So is there any link between the trade secret protection and the regulatory framework as of now with related to biologics?
Yeah, this is an essential question, and these are hard to get into in 15 minutes. Look, I think there are a couple of things we should separate here.
Go back to your old mic.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
Hello? No.
You still can't hear me?
What about now?
Yeah, this is perfect. Yeah.
Is it okay now? Okay.
Yeah.
I sincerely apologize. I just don't do this enough, and I really come across like a doofus. Look, I think there are a couple of things that we have to separate here, Gopa. When you look at the Serum Institute, they spent 2 years reverse engineering a 10-valent GlaxoSmithKline vaccine, a pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. So the intellectual property created a 2-year delay. Because if there was no intellectual property, they wouldn't have had to spend 2 years. They could have spent 4 months.
Intellectual property, you mean the patents, or you mean?
I mean patents. No, I mean patents. Yeah. So I'm trying to separate intellectual property from other proprietary information, let's say, yes? So the intellectual property here refers specifically to registered intellectual property like patents. The patents on PCV10 prevented a 4 to 5 month window to develop an equivalent product. That meant that Serum Institute spent 2 years doing that. After that, however, the refusal, but look, I'm saying refusal, but they were never asked. So neither did Serum ask, nor did Gavi ask GlaxoSmithKline to simply say, hey, hand over your cell lines and a tech transfer package to Serum so that they can make it. To the best of my knowledge, they were never asked, right? So the lack of that authorized cooperation meant that the regulatory system in India recognized them only as a new vaccine, right? And as a result, they spent 8 years going through the entire set of clinical trials that they needed to do. So it wasn't actually access to the information. It wasn't access to the trade secrets that GSK held. It was literally the lack of a formal cooperative agreement like Serum Institute now has with AstraZeneca, for instance. So now when they're producing the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Indian regulatory system recognizes them as being merely another facility that's producing the same AstraZeneca vaccine. So it gives them a very abbreviated runway to regulatory approval, right? So I listened to David's presentation with great interest, and I think that trade secrets are playing an enormous role in this pandemic, and they do play a role in vaccines. But I want to say that the reason they play a role is that they are being unjustly and unfairly weighted by the regulatory system, if you understand what I'm trying to say. A lot of the information around vaccines has to be disclosed. It's not possible. Look, it's really not possible to file patent applications without disclosing information. It is possible sometimes in the United States to withhold certain aspects of ongoing clinical trials data. It is possible, towards the end to withhold some degree of, what the results of the data held. But there is still a large amount of public information on these vaccines that is available, that is mandated, and in terms of reverse engineering a product, that's kind of all they need. The regulatory system creates the situation of trade secrets playing an outsized role in deciding whether you are a known thing or a new thing, right? In truth, Serum Institute in 2010, it did not need the cell lines, that originated from whatever original hamsters or whatever it was that Pfizer used or GlaxoSmithKline used. They didn't actually need that to have an abbreviated runway. They could have had that same abbreviated runway if the system was more rational, and it simply created better ways to test equivalence in biosimilars, including vaccines, right? So trade secrets are playing an enormous role here. But the reason, in part, we should acknowledge that they are playing such an outsized role in access to vaccines is because we have a regulatory system that's stacked in favor of originator vaccine manufacturers that irrationally, unfairly, and inefficiently privileges those trade secrets as being the only repositories of a certain degree of quality and reliability, whereas a large number of studies indicate that that's not the case, and this is how, in some ways, you either have a licensed product, or you have nothing, or you have the very, very few biosimilars that exist in the world, whether it's here in India or in the United States.
Thank you, Achal. So
Hey, Gopa, can I just add very quickly,
Sure,
follow up? Yeah, and so Achal, I 100% agree, right? And just to make your point clear, in the context of trade secrecy, this is why I say not all trade secrets need to be treated as trade secrets, right? In order to not only have profits, but have the kind of development necessary. I completely agree with you that not only is it weighted heavily, but it's received wisdom that you must have trade secrecy in all of these forms in order to get development, it's just not true. So, you know, maybe offline, because I know we're short on time, I'd love to talk to you about that, because that's precisely the argument from a trade secret angle, and that's how I think you can get at solving some of these problems quickly. So thank you for those comments.
It's a bit like the Wizard of Oz, I just want to say, right? Because we think of this trade secret, which is, you know, the New York Times had an article about Serum Institute developing the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine. And it started off with the fact that apparently a silver box, which was padded with velvet, was shipped in from the United States, which contained the original biological material that was used at the Jenner Institute. You know, and this is a bit like being in the 1970s and talking about the secret Coke formula. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, I mean, it's really more myth than reality. So it's not like Serum needed those original cell lines. It's not like Serum could have done without it. Sure, it's faster if you get the cell lines and you get the technology transfer process, because you don't have to replicate it. But they could have done it in a year and a half or two, right? But it's the fact that without that silver box with the velvet ropes or whatever it is that they did, without that little booklet of the technology, the Indian regulatory government, the system would have made them wait another 8 years to get approval instead of 7 months.
Thank you. So we received around 8-9 questions. So some of these questions have been already answered by the respective panelists already. So, but still there are one or two questions I would like to read out. So one question, I think it's by and large, I think directed to David. It's let me just read out. How do we balance human rights and ethical responsibility to humanity over the trade interests? I think you can, I am just saying that even the trade secret that go beyond these in case of communicable disease and specifically pandemic situations. So basically looking at the human rights and ethical consideration over trade interest or trade secrets. So whether that makes a good argument.
Right.
And also
So,
there is one more related questions. There is also a question saying that what are the kinds of information that a corporation might refuse to share freely, citing trade secret protection? So you can answer these together.
Sure. Yeah. So on the second question, that was, and I'll show it very quickly again just to answer it. On the second question, that was this slide. Right. All of this information. And Achal kind of referred to some of it just now, are potential, and let's be clear, actual trade secrets that exist within industry, right? So any or all of this can be alleged as trade secrets so long as the argument can be made that it's valuable because it's not known by a competitor and we have tried to protect its secrecy. That's it. And once that argument is made, generally speaking, as Achal just referred to, right, you have the ability to act against anyone that accesses that trade secret, much less uses it. And there's a lot more there, but that sums it up. On the second point, or the first question, that's the hard thing. Trade secret law was not, and has not been conceived as a body of law where there's any other interest other than preventing unfair competition. So in other words, if a competitor would use the information in a way that is unfair, then therefore there should be a trade secret misappropriation cause of action. There's almost nothing in trade secret law other than TRIPS and Doha, like I pointed out earlier, and some very limited exceptions for whistleblowers in the United States, or certain public interests that are very narrowly construed in the EU, for any argument in trade secret law that says the public, civil society groups, or even competitors should have access to trade secrets. This is why, to be clear, folks, this is such a huge issue in terms of access information, because it's not just vaccines. In the United States, regulatory entities trying to confirm whether voting machines are working properly, okay, which is a kind of an important thing for a country that claims to be a democracy, have been told you can't access that code because it's a trade secret, okay, and full stop. And it's taken legislation, which often isn't enforced, to force voting machine manufacturers to share information with election officials trying to determine whether the voting machine is working properly. right? We've had other situations where individuals have been charged with driving while intoxicated in the United States and have wanted to interrogate breathalyzer machines, okay, to see whether the breathalyzer machines, which is all of the evidence used against these individuals by prosecutors, were working properly. And the manufacturer said, you can't access that defendant who's going to go to jail, right, because there are trade secrets inside the machines. And it's taken court action to share some of that information, okay, and that's not always been the case. So we're literally talking about trade secrecy being more important than life and liberty in the United States when it comes to being charged with crimes, and that's happening throughout the globe. So this is why I say that trade secrecy is by far the most powerful law within IP when it comes to access to information. Because you might think it should be received wisdom that in a global pandemic, the kinds of arguments that Yuan and Achal and Tiru and Gopa and really everyone's Sanjita have been making should be, really non-controversial, right? Should be non-controversial. We can show you that you can produce this in a way that benefits the public and benefits the world's people in terms of affordability, in terms of scale, in terms of efficacy, if you just share more information. And I will tell you, trade secrets are so fixed within what we believe to be necessary for companies to operate, aside from all of the lobbying and political issues that we're not talking about as much here, that it's a hard argument to make. This is why Doha and TRIPS are so important. This is why, and I have to credit Brooke Baker for this because he kind of convinced me of it a bit more, that CTAP should be taken more seriously, even though I know that it hasn't been successful, to put it mildly. And this is why I think seizing on the Moderna statement, and I defer to experts that work on this on a daily basis, might be a very good idea. Because I'm confident that Moderna wouldn't be saying this if they didn't see ways, right, to actually share some information, even if they don't actually intend to do so, without having the business fold. So I've been railing against this for years, but this is why trade secrecy is so important to focus on, because I do think it's at the root of moving us much further than we are right now.
There's one question directed to Achal. You can have a look at it. It's about a summary. You can probably answer there itself. But there is another question, even though it is directed to David, but it's I would like all the panelists should respond to that question, which says that what can be done to make the private sector, which is the biggest stakeholder affected by IP, welcome the idea of sharing some potential trade secret like negative information, yet they are in a competition. But I would like to expand this question and say that what activists or the scholars or even the lawyers can do to have much more open sharing of information related to COVID medical products, which is not protected under the garb of trade secret. What can you do that? Because it's the end of the day that one can say that, look, it's my secret. I keep it as a secret. So what ways you can nudge or force or make them to share this because there is a global public good. You can have open manufacturing. You can have open innovation. If the informations are readily shared. So what can we do? In the case of patent, okay, you can issue a compulsory license, but here in the case of a trade secret, you are not in a position to issue a compulsory license because the one person has to share this information. So, but at the same time, the science and technology also develop. You don't need specifically to share it also sometimes, right? So within that, taking in that broad context, so how do you respond? Okay. So, can
I take a stab at it? Look, I think that when we're talking about trade secrets as being restrictive in terms of providing information on the technologies themselves, which has really been much of the focus of David's work, and I think that's absolutely essential. The way that we can get over that is by actually requiring and having strict disclosure for any kind of certification. So whether it's certification at the FDA, if it's certification at the Indian drug approval of at the Indian drug regulator, if it's patent, if it's the granting of a patent, the more we increase and mandate sufficient disclosure, we can free the information that's sitting at vaccine manufacturers, at biologics manufacturers. But I want to make a small point here, which is that the trade secrets, compulsory license patents have kind of an international police. That international police is the WTO, it's TRIPS, it's national and international courts. Trade secrets, to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been that many disputes around, in the pharmaceutical industry around international appropriation of trade secrets. Their police really are the drug regulatory systems in the world. The drug regulatory systems in the United States, in India, they act as the enforcer of pharmaceutical industry trade secrets. It's why there are so few biosimilars in comparison to biologics as there are generic small molecules in comparison to other patented small molecules. So by creating a system where trade secrets are privileged and policed by drug regulatory systems, we are giving those trade secrets a power that I don't think they deserve. By reforming drug regulation for biologics, which is an urgently necessary thing, which unfortunately it took this pandemic to show, though, people have been talking about this since the pneumonia vaccine, since, at least the last 15 years. The way to defang the snake of trade secrets is to create a rational regulation system that doesn't give them as much power. It's not power that's deserved. There is actually no magic formula there that particularly helps. Any biologic, any vaccine with different degrees from complex to simple can be replicated, can be made. Every vaccine manufacturer I've talked to in India has said that. This is an artificial barrier, and it's made real by the existence of drug regulatory systems that privilege trade secrets.
Yuan, and then we can go back to David, and Thiru also is encouraged to make an intervention on this in the light of Moderna, because the trade secret word is missing from the Moderna's statement, actually. So, Yuan, you would like to make any?
Yeah, nothing to add on the Moderna. I mean, I agree with
not Moderna, but what an activist can do to open it up. One suggestion has come clearly saying that regulatory agencies, regulatory reform is required. There should not be the police of the enforcer of the trade secret.
Yes, I think I agree with that, and also I think it's really interesting timing also when this news comes out. I mean, Thiru mentioned it's about the investigation, so it's probably already kind of some public pressure started building on this candidate and on this vaccine, and then there's I mean, hopefully, I kept saying this proposal from South Africa, India is also a kind of actually a very good time to everybody to relook at what the situation is, and then how it could be a tactic for Moderna and say, okay, I open my patent, but everybody know it's not enough. So where is your trade secret and know-how? I think I agree to call for non-enforcement, and then it also could be a very good example to other companies who are developing vaccines who hasn't shown any sign of sharing, and also to government to see there is a way you can do legally to announce not enforcement, and for civil society to take this opportunity to call for those actions to be taken. Yeah, I agree with that.
And just and to both of those points, recognize, as Achal and Yuan was just saying, right? Trade secrets are not issued by governments. Patents are issued by governments, right? Trade secrets exist simply because you meet the standard, which means the enforcement not only happens by regulatory entities, but it's by the courts. And generally, you lose a trade secret, right, either because you accidentally disclose it, or it's reverse engineered, in which case it's not a trade secret, or it's independently discovered, or you lose it in litigation, where you assert a trade secret right and the court says you don't have a trade secret. But the point is, again, the challenge here is encouraging industry to operate in this space. There is nothing stopping an entity from sharing all of its trade secrets right now, right? I could take all of the trade secrets that I hold, all of them, and just put them online and it's done. Of course, you could do the same thing with patents, right? I mean, you could say, I'm not going to enforce my patent rights, right? But that's largely discretionary unless a government withdraws the patent or the patent's lost in litigation. With trade secrecy, right, it's all subject to whatever the private entity thinks, right, they need and what they want to do. And that is fundamentally the problem, right? I was asked earlier about where these public interest values are in trade secrecy. Arguably, they're not there at all, right? They have to be created legislatively, or people on this call and these groups need to push back. I 100% agree with Yuan that now, if there was ever a time to make these arguments, a global health crisis on the scale of this pandemic, right? And one, by the way, and I apologize for editorializing, but one that is preventable if one wears masks. But I'm speaking to my fellow countrymen here in the United States, right? Wear your mask. But if there's ever a preventable pandemic that would allow for this kind of argument to be made forcefully, now is the time to do it. Now is the time to do it. And if that is done, I will tell you folks, I know that many people on this call may not be interested in this, but I want to be clear. Companies aren't going to fold. We're not going to stop getting vaccines. We're not going to stop getting voting machines. We're going to actually have, as Achal, I think, indicated, a much more just society that allows for the world's people to have more access to the kinds of things that make life happy and good. And we can make money while doing it. And I'm saying this, I'm making this argument, folks, this way because that is at the core of how you push back, right? Fighting the argument or making the argument on the terms within IP, aside from the broader issues about the kind of society that we want. And I should say I'm available to work with anyone that wants to work on this issue. God help me. My dean will let me do it so long as I keep teaching my classes.
Thank you, David. And Thiru, do you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. Some pertinent details government funding of Moderna that my colleagues in DC just reminded me of, and one of them, by the way, is participating, is that KI and Public Citizen, they examined a Moderna contract, and it basically said that they had to.
It's not audible. I think, Thiru, you are muted.
Could you repeat?
Actually, your mic doesn't seem to be working, Thiru.
No.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes.
now. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I guess you missed all that. Just to say that my colleagues at KEI and Public Citizen, when they examined a Moderna contract, it said that Moderna had to disclose how much total and also in terms of proportion of public funds they were receiving. And they weren't disclosing that at the time. And then subsequently they issued a press release where it said 100% was funded by BARDA. And just one other thing, one of the penalties for failure to disclose could be that an agency could take title to the patent. And, that's happened with the Army in the 1990s. So that also could have played a part in this. And I will just end by saying, getting back to the WTO, another article, there have been a slew of excellent articles mainly by the Indian press and others, but just now in the context of the DG race, the Financial Times has just published a piece on the India-South Africa submission. and what the candidates have said about it. So I can share with you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Thiru.
That'd be great. And just one thing on that, Thiru, just to dispel a myth. There's a general belief, well, if the public is funding something, then that means they should have access to it. And that's not the case either. Trade secrecy operates in a space where even if the government funds the creation of the information that is a trade secret rights can still be enforced. Doesn't mean they have to be. It doesn't mean they have to be, but there are plenty of examples of that throughout the globe. On the other hand, policymakers could decide, right, and public pressure could be brought to say, if we're paying for it, taxpayers, right, then we taxpayers should have more access rights, right? We should have a better idea of what's being done. But recognize that even in that scenario, trade secrecy can say, yeah, you paid for it, but it's still our trade secret.
Thank you. So we are coming to the close of this very interesting webinar. All the speakers pointed out, especially one of the important area which activists have not hitherto paid much attention to it, that is trade secret, and also the link between the trade secret and the role played by the regulatory agencies for enforcing this in the name of protecting quality and efficacy of the medicine or the vaccines. In fact, enforcing an intellectual property rights like trade secret. So thank you once again to all the speakers for taking time and for participating in this webinar. Also, around 60 participants. After 1 hour 45 minutes later, we could retain around 60 participants. That is also shows the interest in the subject. There are two specific questions came up later. One is to Achal, actually, to asking Achal to give any kind of PCV case studies written up, then to share with Karar, and also Malini asked what about having an backup or alternative strategy if South Africa and India proposal doesn't take off, either global or national level. So I think probably you people can interact them bilaterally. Then, or if you would like to to answer right now, I can give like 1 or 2 minutes, and then we can close this webinar. Yeah, go ahead, Yuan.
Yeah, I was just writing and at the same time answering Malini's question. I think there's one article written by Professor Frederick Abbott talking about cross-border collaboration on production. I think the idea was interesting. I mean, well, first we hope this proposal will fly, right? So that's really a momentum, but at the same time, I think the spirit is really to encourage country to think together, not to just think about my land and my people, because we are facing a global pandemic. Everybody will not be safe, if the other people are still suffering. So encourage country to think together, recognizing any national level, only action would not be enough. So any regional approach or like-minded country working together in the spirit of collaboration and collectively addressing IP issues would help ramping up and increase the manufacturing and supply capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuan. Once again, the message is very clear, especially in the context of trade secrets, and basically we need to sort of democratize science. Science also protect a lot of, there is science as well as there is a lot of commercial interest. We need to look into that and sort of democratize. That's what the task for organizations like People Health Movement. So let me thank once again all the participants as well as the speakers, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.